Okay, following on from my last one, I thought I'd have a quick look at how well does Parliament scrutinise legislation. First point to make is that most new laws are introduced by the executive. There are a few exceptions. There are private members' bills which individual MPs can introduce. Most of them fail. The only ones that survive, if you like, are those that have the support of the government. A good example at the moment is Dan Biles, who's the MP in Bedworth, MP for North Warwickshire. He's currently managed to pass through the House of Commons a bill about reforming the membership of the House of Lords, so keep an eye on that one. Anyway, getting back to Parliament in general, one reason why the executive dominates and Parliament isn't very good at scrutinising laws is the fact that the government controls the passage of bills. The timetable for Parliament is decided by someone called the Leader of the House. He is a cabinet member, i.e. a member of the executive. Therefore, it's in his interest to make sure that government-supported bills which the government are desperate to pass, they can pass through with the greatest ease, so to speak. A second way in which Parliament can scrutinise legislation is through the legislative committees. However, I would argue that these are really weak. They are made up always of majority of the MPs on these committees are made up of a governing party, and these MPs have been largely chosen by the government's whips. Therefore, they have chosen MPs who are least likely to cause difficulties in passing that bill or discussing that bill. They vote at the end of their deliberation on that bill along partisan lines, usually. So again, the opposition may well have amendments to make, but they'll probably be voted down. Also, these committees are only temporary, so therefore they've not built up any expertise at looking at these particular issues. So a backbench MP might be asked to go and look at a transport bill. They then might be asked a few weeks later to go to another committee to look at, I don't know, a proposed bill on something else, education or something. So they probably won't have many experts on those particular committees in the House of Commons. So again, that reduces how well it can scrutinise potential legislation. I would argue that the House of Lords is better at doing this. Because remember, the House of Lords contains a number of experts. You know, we've mentioned before Professor Robert Winston, expert in fertility treatment, and Lord Alan Sugar on business, etc, etc. So these characters on these committees, because the House of Lords tends to have a different way of doing their committees, they can actually scrutinise the legislation using their expertise. And so the House of Lords, especially since 1999, has been far keener to introduce a number of amendments to particular bills. Now, the biggest problem is that the House of Lords is not elected, and it can be overridden by the House of Commons. They can pass something called the Parliament Act. Also, the government, might just ignore those particular amendments. It might go back to the House of Commons and they might basically get rid of most of the amendments which the House of Lords possess. Remember, the Salisbury Convention means the Lord is limited in the length of time it can actually scrutinise bills for. However, that said, although governments can use this to their advantage, it looks bad politically if they've had to resort to bullying tactics of using the Parliament Act to override the House of Lords. And so the House of Lords, I would say, does put through amendments, and not always, but on a fairly regular basis, the government will accept those amendments. And you've all got examples down from the Politics Review article about the Health and Social Care Act, for example, with its, I can't remember what was it, 510 amendments or something. Also, another problem which Parliament has in scrutinising legislation and in scrutinising the executive as a general rule is the fact that MPs in the House of Commons tend to vote on party lines. Yes, there are rebellions, but very rarely does the government lose in these rebellions. The Blair government, for example, towards the end, especially from 2001 onwards when Iraq was taking place, suffered a large number of rebellions. A rebellion is when an MP does not vote for his own party, he votes for the opposite. However, the Blair government was only defeated in its entire period about 6 or 7 times, so it's very rare for a government to be defeated. The coalition, if you look at the figures, and I showed you them in class, again you've got this big graph that shows this massive amount of rebellions taking place compared to previous governments. However, it has not been defeated, and it has managed to push through some really controversial legislation. You know, the reform to the NHS, tuition fees, things like the bedroom tax and the social welfare reforms. So I would argue that Parliament is not very good at scrutinising legislation for the reasons I've outlined above. They control the passage of the bills, the government, so those legislative committees are rather weak, I would argue, and the fact that most MPs vote along party lines. I would though say that the House of Lords does a bit of a better job, although it too has got its limitations due to the Salisbury Convention and those sorts of things. So if you get a question about how well does Parliament scrutinise legislation, these are some of the points to talk about. If you get a more general question, you know, how well does Parliament perform its functions, you'll probably do a paragraph or two on legislation. Again, some of these are some of the key points to include.